Hello, scholars. Welcome to our American Revolution Lesson 12. It is part B. We're wrapping up the end part of Lesson 12 today. Our objectives. What we will be learning about, what we will be doing today. We will learn what happened that fateful night of April 18th, 1775. Kind of what happened after I left you with that cliffhanger. And we will today hear about the first two battles of the American Revolution. So, to remind you where we left off, we ended our last class with the following questions. Which route would the British soldiers take? Would the Son of Liberty in the tower of Old North Church light one lantern or two? Will Sam Adams and John Hancock be captured in Lexington? Will the British soldiers seize the supplies hidden in Concord? Well, you're about to find out the answers to all these questions, as well as what happens in both Lexington and Concord when the Redcoats arrive. That fateful night of the 18th of April in 1775, the young Son of Liberty hung two lanterns in the tower of Old North Church, signaling to Paul Revere that the British soldiers would be crossing the Charles River first, meaning they're taking the green route. Ah, remember one if by land, two if by sea? Well, now we know. Two if by sea. They'd be crossing the water first. Paul Revere borrowed a horse and took off on that route, just like William Dawes had done on the other route. He stopped in every village and at every farm, warning patriots along the way that the Redcoats were coming. Paul Revere made it to Lexington ahead of the British soldiers and warned Sam Adams and John Hancock that the Redcoats were coming. Luckily, the two men got away before the Redcoats arrived. But what the Redcoats did find when they arrived was 70 Minutemen facing them on the village green, ready to fight. Imagine their surprise. There they stood for what would be the first battle of the American Revolution. On one side, 600 to 700 well trained, well armed men in handsome red uniforms. On the other side, a much smaller group of 70 rough dressed men with fewer weapons. The British ordered the Minutemen to leave. Suddenly, someone opened fire, and both sides began shooting. Just a few minutes later, 8 Minutemen were dead, and 10 were wounded. And Billy Dawes and Paul Revere, well, they were both caught before they could ride ahead to warn Concord. But luckily, another patriot named Dr. Samuel Prescott rode on to Concord to warn the people there that the Redcoats were coming. And when the British soldiers arrived in Concord, they were able to find and destroy some of the hidden supplies and weapons, but they were again surprised to find, this time, Minutemen waiting for them once again. 400 of them gathered at the North Bridge, near the village green of Concord. British soldiers at the bridge opened fire. Minutemen fired back. After 5 minutes of fighting, the British decided to return to their base back in Boston. Yes, they retreated. That long march back to Boston was a nightmare for the Redcoats. All those people who lived along the route had been alerted by Paul Revere earlier. They had watched as the British troops marched to Lexington in those early morning hours. And now they were ready as the soldiers marched back to Boston. They were ready and waiting behind stone fences, behind barns, behind trees. When the soldiers in their bright red uniforms appeared, they were easy targets. All the way back to Boston, shots rang out as the Redcoats were fired upon. Before the British troops got back to Boston that night, the Minutemen had killed 73 of them and wounded 200. Scholars, that was nearly half of the British force from the start of that day. But the colonists had experienced losses too. Nearly 50 Minutemen had died. Now, the Patriots, the Americans, did not know it at the time, but with these first two battles, the Battle of Lexington and the Battle of Concord, the War for Independence had officially begun. And that is where we're going to stop for today. So, checking in on our objectives, we learned what happened that fateful night of the 18th of April in 1775, how many lanterns were hung, what became of Sam Adams and John Hancock, what happened to Billy Dawes and Paul Revere, and who is this person named Samuel Prescott? We learned all about that. We also heard about the first two battles of the American Revolution, the Battle of Lexington and the Battle of Concord. The first two battles in what would become several battles in the War for Independence. And your assignment. Open the attached Google form and answer the questions about today's lesson. Remember, you may look back at the lesson, listen to information again, look at the slides. Click submit at the bottom of that Google form when you're finished. Send those answers to your teacher. Thanks for joining me, scholars, and we'll see you next time for another exciting lesson in our study of the American Revolution.